Their father was John, and one of the people I'm going to be speaking about is their great-great-great-great-aunt, Altha Cauch, Merrifield Cauch. And I couldn't have gotten a lot of the stuff if it hadn't been for Beth, because she had squirreled away all these wonderful articles. And of course, whenever I had a question anyway, I would call Lori first, because I've known her since forever, since I've been here. And of course, the family has been here forever. They are direct line descendants of the original Merrifield clan and have been here since the 1880s when this town started. Related to Peter Wall, I'll just hold this up so you can see. This is the Wall cemetery stone. I think it's the only cemetery stone in Lake Elsinore Cemetery that has like 20 names on it, and all the Wall family, which comes from that, is buried right there. Their family has been here for 7 unbroken generations. I don't think very many people in any town can say that. And even though Beth is no longer here, you're in Orange County, right?
Yeah, my heart is still here.
Yes. So I want to especially thank them. And if I misspeak, I'm sure both of them are quite competent to stand up and say, "You got it wrong, Jeanie," because they knew Altha very well. But when I was asked to do this for Women's History, we selected 3 women. One was Margaret Collier Graham. Altha Merrifield Cauch was number 2. Jean Hayman was number 3. Even though I've been in Elsinore only about 60 years, I felt like I knew quite a bit about Margaret Collier Graham and discovered I knew diddly. So I'm going to start with her first. And for those of you that say, yes, you're going to be on note cards, my answer is, I always write, and so I'm going to double check with all of these things. Margaret Collier Graham was one of 4 children born to Lydia Ann and David Collier. She was born in 1850, and she once said she didn't believe it was only hearsay. She was the youngest of the 4. Her oldest sister was Martha, known as Maddie, William, her older brother, Eliza Jane, her older sister, Jenny, another older sister, and Margaret, who was known as Maggie. The family lived in Keokuk, Iowa. She went to grammar school and was one of 8 women at the age of 19 in the graduating class of Monmouth College in Illinois in 1869 with her brother William and her future husband, Donald McIntyre Graham. They were 2 of the 30 men that graduated, and she was one of 8 women that graduated. She and Donald married October 21st in 1873, and since Donald had tuberculosis, and at that time there was no known cure, they decided in 1876 that they would take the train and come to the far west. They bought tickets for $150 to San Francisco, and they left July 7th, 1876. They went first, of course, to San Francisco. They went on to Los Angeles, but most of the time that they were involved with Southern California, it was with what was called the Indiana colony that later became South Pasadena. Donald had gotten the postal route for $8, and he drove the mail from LA to Pasadena on a regular basis. They built their first home there for a cost of $423, which was quite a lot of money at the time, but they really loved it. She was the first editor of Pasadena's newspaper, and it was called The Reservoir. Now, we know Margaret Collier Graham, we know William Collier, and we know Donald Graham because of their association with Franklin Heald, the gentleman who came to Lake Elsinore, saw the lake from the Pasadena area, and was instrumental in buying it. What I didn't realize before was that the Grahams and William Collier were here only short time. I thought they had been here much longer than they were, but because of Donald's health and because of the social circles that they ran in, they were very different from Franklin Heald. Many of you may or may not know that when Wildemar was first created, it was the portion of South Elsinore that all three of them, of the gentlemen, had bought together. And they had bought it with the notion of creating one solid community that encompassed around the lake and would be one area. There were some differences of opinion. Nobody knows exactly what those differences were, but they were serious differences. And from what I have found by reading and looking at old newspapers, tends to indicate that Franklin Heald cut a few corners that morally offended both the Colliers and Grahams. So they decided to split up the area. Originally, the area to the south was called Weldon. But Margaret, being the kind of person she was, a gifted writer and an outspoken woman, very progressive, she said, wait a minute, what about me? I came with this group too. I'd like at least a little consideration. And so they changed the names to Wildomar, which was Will for William Collier, Doe for Donald, not Do-si-do, and Mar for Margaret. And in that breakup of the property, Franklin Heald kept everything from Sedco Hills up along all the way to Main Street and over to Collier Avenue, and then going to the northwest. Collier and Graham established the Wildemar area, but the problem they had with that still was health related because Donald was ill. So Margaret had to be the major breadwinner, and she was. A lot of the things she wrote were articles for the Argonaut magazine, St. Nicholas and Frank Leslie's Weekly, which became the lady book of the late 19th century. She wrote Womanhood for the Ventura Sentinel, and she was listed as one of Southern California's most gifted writers. An article she wrote was called Perdita, or the Little Lost One. She wrote an article about Weirs, Matilda, Mrs. Health, Bryce, Weatherby's wife, and she started teaching school for approximately $75 a month. But it was hard for her to do because of Donald's health. She actually taught in East LA for quite a while. And while there, she wrote Uncle Jack Cavendish, A Clerical Tramp for the Californian, and also just an article called Land. In December of 1880, Don was writing, and that was when he was sending things to the press in Riverside, and every week or every month, he did an article for the Press Enterprise. And when they joined forces with Franklin Field, they made a great deal of money with the speculative land boom of the 1880s. Once that ceased to be profitable, they cleared everything away because Donald himself had gotten so ill. He died in 1890, and so she had to free and not be encumbered by the land out here. But the most notable thing she did, of course, was pick the name of Elsinore. She had never been to Europe, but because her family and her husband and all of their relatives traveled in high social circles, they knew people who had been to Europe. They knew where Elsinore in Denmark was, and they were all voracious readers and voracious writers, and so they felt the lake in its pristine state in the 1880s was something akin to some place in the far north of Europe, where there were glaciers and beautiful lakes and wonderful mountains. So Elsinore was named for, of course, Elsinore, which is in Denmark, and of course was mentioned in the play Hamlet. She died actually in 1910. But before she died, the things that she and Donald accomplished in South Pasadena were really stellar. They established not only the library there, they built a beautiful home that all kinds of people came to see. And the book, We Three Came West, is a precise chronicle of their love letters and various letters back to family members, because they actually brought all their family out from Keokuk, Iowa, especially when in the 1880s there was the terrible drought, the first really terrible Midwestern drought that caused so many people to immigrate. What amazes me about this woman is she was not only an early feminist, but she was a gracious early feminist. And she did everything she could with people around her so that they would all know that a woman's place was anywhere and everywhere she wanted to be, and that she could do whatever she needed to do to raise a family, to keep a household together, and to influence others around for the good of mankind. They were very, very definite Midwestern Quaker stock Christians. They were simple in how they approached life. Much of it was very black and white, no shades of gray. And they lived a life that spoke of providence that Scripture talked about. They shared where they could, they did what they could, but most of all, they were people with an idea of building community. So, I think that's actually all I really want to say about Margaret Collier, because I didn't know her personally, but I was blessed to know Altha, Merrifield, Cauch. When I first came to Elsinore, I was about 20 years old. There were no stop signs. Everybody knew everybody else. There were 2 markets. This was still the Methodist Church. If you didn't know somebody, you'd get acquainted really soon. Machado School had just opened, and it was surrounded by the watermelon fields of the Stewart Ranch, and there were still the big nut orchards. Torn Ranch was still Torn Ranch with all its pecans and all the things that they had. We had one stop sign at four corners, no electric lights doing anything. You could walk into the Alamo Market, and if you didn't have enough money, if you knew the cashier, you could write on the back of your slip your name and your phone number, and they'd let you take the groceries home. Not like today where you would find somebody that would say, "Lady, you see this coin? It says in God we trust," and nobody else. And the only reason I know that was because I had to do that one time. And the cashier said, "We know who you are, we know where you live." And I got my groceries home. Elsinore was a charming, bucolic, quiet little town where everybody knew everybody else. And there was a camaraderie, a sense of ownership, a sense of protection. Your neighbors had your back. Your family could come and be anywhere, and you would meet other people that felt the way you did about small town life. It was a weekender community. Early on in the 1920s, it was what Palm Springs became in the 50s and 60s because movie stars came here. There were many, many people who came to this town and who were enchanted by it. Linda had mentioned earlier, why aren't you talking about Amy Semple McPherson? And yeah, she was a major mover and shaker here. But Altha Cauch was more than just a woman. She was an institution to this valley. I was blessed to know her. These two lovely ladies were blessed to be related to her. And she was the town's first librarian, but more importantly, she was the town's first historian. She was born not in Lake Elsinore, but in Horse Thief Canyon on June the 3rd, 1892. She took great pride in that because she was a year older than Riverside County. Her family was, her mother was Berdilla Dewey. And Berdilla came out here when she was 17 years old to marry Charles Merrifield, who I believe was called Carl. Don't ask me why, that was just what he went by. But when she came from New York on a train for 13 days, 17 years old. She arrived here in the mid-18, look and see, in my notes here. Yeah, in 1885. Oh, thank you. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, I have Barrett syndrome. That's why I sound so bad. And Charles Merrifield came from the Massachusetts Merrifields that go all the way back in genealogy to the 1680s. So you have people that can trace their roots not only to the founding of America, but the founding definitely of one community here. When Altha was 4 years old, Berdilla died suddenly. I do not know what caused her death, and I don't know that there is any record of what caused her death. But Charles was left with this beautiful, tiny little child, and he then remarried and married Ida Wall, Peter's daughter. Peter, of course, is the man who founded the Elsinore Cemetery in 1891. And Ida became not only Altha's stepmother, Altha always referred to her as mother. And she also had a half-sibling brother, Leslie. And there was one other child, at least according to the information from the cemetery, a girl,
Zora.
Zora. Okay. So, anyway, as a little girl, she attended several schools in the valley. She went first to the Willard School. Willard was the area at the bottom of the lake on the other side where Grand Avenue is. And then she spent some time at the Lake School that was established on Machado Street. And then finally, she did attend Elsinore Grammar School. Now, the grammar school was located where Elsinore Grammar School is now, but it was a two-story building then. And because there was terrible typhoid, they moved it to the building that's right down the street here on the corner of Franklin and Main, which is the old DAR, or GAR, sorry, George. We didn't have the DAR then, or if they did, they weren't here. But that building served as a school because at that time, quite a few of the youngsters in Lake Elsinore died of typhoid. When Altha went to high school, she was part of the freshman class in 1905 that picked out the school colors. And at that time, the Tigers were orange and brown, not red and white as they are now. But she was part of the group that organized the very first student body in the school. They picked out E for earnestness and H for honesty for the first of the four letters EHUS. And they couldn't come up with anything that the U stood for or the other S. So those were left for other school students at a later time. But she was one of two graduates in 1909. She wore her mother's necklace and she had a white organza dress when she graduated. We have pictures of her over here. And thanks to Beth, I have a series of pictures of her that are extant that Beth has kept because Beth, like her Aunt Altha and her other aunt, Lila Knight, is a third-generation librarian, which makes it really neat to think about that wealth of history, the scope of gathering books, making sure people read, making sure they understand what they're reading and why they're reading it, and enjoying the camaraderie you have in books, because you can use your imagination for everything when you read. Too often we get these little sound bites, and even looking at what's going on with the Ukraine, I know I think to myself, I don't need the commercials. Why don't they just show me what is going on so I get a sense? Why don't they have more of the people talking so you can actually hear? That's what Altha, that's what Lila, that's what Beth does. Make sure students value reading and value the books. There's so many things about Altha to say. She was part of the production of Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. She read quotations from Lincoln at one of the patriotic celebrations we had here. She was part of Job's Daughter. She was an Eastern Star for 61 years. And because she adored her father, who was a city councilman for 13 years, a blacksmith, a builder, who would be considered a construction manager or actual just in construction all the time, he was the person that raised the money, not only for the first schools, but for the first library. And she started in organizing the library and spent most of her entire life as the local librarian. The old library, which is now, what is it now? What do they call that now?
It's a youth center.
Youth center. That was originally the library area where she worked, but she worked when the library was first down here on Main Street. And the very, very first was, of course, in her father's shop. Her father was the last surviving member of Lodge 289. And when she married Albert Cauch, she pointed out that when she died, she would be buried between Albert and his first wife, and whose name was Layla. And she said, how many people can say something like that? Which was true, because she spent a great deal of time at the cemetery making sure that her father's grave, other family members' graves, were cared for and tended. Because of her love of education, she hated anyone who spoke with bad grammar. She couldn't abide misspelling. She hated it if you got your facts wrong. And she was the continual librarian from 1938 to 1968, not counting all the time she did it for free. I think of her always, when I knew her, as being the little old lady with the broom and the dustpan who walked up and down the streets of Lake Elsinore. She was feisty. She was about my age now, I think, or maybe a little younger when I first knew her. And I asked, who is that lady that's always sweeping the streets? And I went to her one time and I said, why are you always doing this? And she said, well, I'll tell you why. And she proceeded to do so. And she and I became really grand friends because I started working at the newspaper, and I had a column called Now and Then. And I'd go back in the morgue and take things out of the newspaper that had happened 50, 25, 10 years ago. Just little bits and pieces that I found incredibly interesting. And she'd come in with a broom, and she'd take it like a staff, the bristles up, whack the floor in the newspaper office. So when I heard her, I knew Altha was out there, and she wanted to tell me something. And she never failed to say, you didn't get this quite right. Let me tell you what really happened. And it was so important to listen to those things because she had seen them, she had recorded them, she knew them. And people in town that didn't know would say, if you don't know what's something else, ask Altha. It was something she was known for. And if we ever do a book about her, I think that's what we should call it. Ask Altha. Because that was what she did best. She told people exactly what they needed to hear, whether they wanted to hear it or not. She took proprietary ownership of this town. It was her town, her father's town, her family's town. She knew everybody of any consequence in this town, and anybody of any consequence knew her. She was noted as the longest-lived property owner in the entire community because her father had built the house on Chestnut Street in about 1924, I think. And she had lived in it. And her house was filled with these incredible knickknacks. She loved bells. She had all kinds of bells. She was the very first Lion of the Month when the Lions Club was organized. She was recognized as the Grand Marshal of the parade when some Hollywood star didn't show up for the Christmas parade. Somebody said, "Get Altha, Cauch." And she said, "Wait, I'm not going like this. I got to get changed." And she put on something and rode in a red Cadillac in 1979.
77.
And she did so many things for this community. The most important being, she remembered to put all the things down that needed to be remembered. She recorded the great things. She recorded the small things. And a lot of the things in this library and in this museum are things that she indirectly helped to create. So when she died April 27th in 1982. She was preceded in death by her husband and her two sons. One was Carl and the other was Daryl.
Daryl only died a few years
Yeah,
ago.
he died
2012.
in 2012. Oh, yeah. I guess because I think of 1982 as just
Yesterday.
Just yesterday. Thank you, Lord. Yes. I think she was a doer, not a talker. She was frank. She was rugged. She was like Margaret Collier Graham. She was plain spoken, but she was a fine Christian lady. You didn't cross her with her morals. She knew what was right. She could tell you where in Scripture to find it. And she could quote the Bible as good as anyone that I've ever known. And she considered herself ordinary. She was not. She was extraordinary as far as I'm concerned. And so the pictures that I have up here are only copies of the pictures that Beth had. You can. January 31st, because this is a 365 thing that you can read all the time. And I want to read just a paragraph. Don't you see how we have to seize the essence of life? We have to embrace every moment. Quote, people need joy quite as much as clothing. Some of them need it far more. That was what Margaret Collier Graham wrote in 1906. And I read that and I thought, I know who this is, because I've been living here in town. So I wrote to the author and told her what I knew about Margaret Collier Graham. And surprise, surprise, she wrote me back. I wrote her again and invited her to come to town. And she wrote me again, declining, but we still write from time to time. And I am still hopeful that one of these times we can get Sarah Van Bretna to come, because it's important that people remember where their roots are. The last person I'll talk about is Jean Hayman. Jean Hayman is a third generation person from Elsinore. James Manford Bell and his wife Catherine came west to find a life that didn't include the ravages of the Civil War. They came to the valley in the early 1880s as a young pioneer couple. They were, I'm sure, acquainted with the Walls and probably acquainted with the Yields and the Grahams and the Colliers as well. Their daughter, Bertie, married Henry Jordan Scherner, and the Scherners left the valley for a brief time, but they missed the small town setting, and they returned by 1920 to be close to Bertie's parents and to raise their family in a quiet and stress-free environment. The Bells have a street named for them. Down by Four Corners, it's very top street on the tallest hill in the immediate area of Four Corners. So I don't know what Mr. Bell did, but obviously he did something to at least have his name on a street. Perhaps he built his house there at the top and they just marked it that way. Jean was one of the Scherner children. They had 4 children: Donald, who died early, Robert, Jean, and Hazel. Jean and her family were Episcopalians. She was born, when was she born? 1922, June 4th, a day after Altha, about 40 years difference, because Altha Merrifield was born on June 3rd. And the neat thing to me that I try to remember is my oldest daughter was also born on June 3rd. My granddaughter was born on June 4th. So lots of people have important birthdays, at least some of the ones that I love the most. Anyway, Jean was a gifted pianist and an artist and a writer at an early age. She was studious and upright, and she was a very obedient daughter. She attended Elsinore Elementary when it was still 1st through 8th grade. And she graduated with her older brother in 1949. She had played the piano for the choral groups in the schools, was part of the choir at school and at church, was editor of the school yearbook, the El Lago, a member of Girls' League, part of the exclusive Usherettes, a member of CSF, and she was awarded a life membership pin at her graduation. She was one of 7 girl graduates in 1949. The other 36 were boys. She, like Altha Cauch, was active in Job's Daughters and was an adult lifetime member, an officer in Eastern Star. She had, like Altha and like Margaret Collier Graham, a very strict upbringing. She was always focused on service to God, family first, and there was no unnecessary nonsense. She went off to college, got her degree in English and education, and returned to Elsinore to teach. She spent her entire teaching career in Lake Elsinore. She started as the very first kindergarten teacher that they had, but she learned really quickly she didn't like kindergarten too much. So she moved to the upper grades and was constantly working with 4th graders, 3rd and 4th graders, and then she also liked working with 5th graders because at the time she said, have you ever noticed how excited little kids are when they come to school? Their eyes are bright. They're just like sponges. They want to learn. They just can't get enough. And by the time they're in 6th grade, it's like, I come to school because I have to. I come to school because I'm going to see my friends. But I'm not too crazy about learning anymore. So she found her niche, making sure that youngsters really learn to read well, learn to write well. And am I going over my time?
No, you are not.
What grade did you have?
Anyway, she loved loved teaching. And even though she and her husband Clarence, who was the local police chief, lived in the big house that no longer exists, was covered with lead paint, had all these things that now don't pass muster and code. But at least we know where the house was. Great house on Main Street. They had no children. But she said, I don't need any children. I've got hundreds of children. I teach children all day long. I help children learn all the things they need to learn. And I enjoy it. Kind of like if you ever saw the original movie or read the book. And now I'm drawing a blank on it. But I could. Anybody know the book that I'm speaking of? It was like one of the lines from the book. That one doesn't matter. She was an old-fashioned, diffident educator. Those of us that knew Jean, she would not look you in the eye. She always talked to you looking like she was looking into the future. And maybe she was, because she had been taught that you never look at anyone's face. You look slightly above, to the right, or to the left of them. And she did that, and a lot of times students would laugh because they would be put off by that Lori.
She was my 5th grade teacher, best teacher I ever had. And I never noticed that, but I remember it now.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Yes. And the one thing, because she was very authoritative in how she dealt with people, I have to say, in all my years of knowing Jean in education, she was ultimately fair. She didn't care how much money you had, what family you came from, where you came from. In her class, you were going to read. And people in the community wanted their children in her classrooms. I know by the time my kids were going to school, I had to get in a waiting line a year and a half before they were even in 2nd grade to say, I want Jean Hayman for my child. And I had 5. And luckily, I got her for all 5 of my children. When she taught at Elsinore Elementary. She taught at Wildemar Elementary, but she spent the bulk of her time at Machado Elementary from 1964 until her retirement in 1982. And when she retired, and even before that, she had established an outstanding girl or an outstanding boy award that she gave every year. And when it was K-8, it went to the outstanding girl and boy of the 8th grade. When the schools were reconfigured for middle school, it went to the best student, the outstanding boy or girl in 6th grade. And it wasn't just about academics. She rewarded youngsters who not only had strong academics, but did lots of help in the community. That were students that mentored other students, that were students that helped other students, that were students that were model students. My youngest daughter and several of her friends loved to irritate Jean. And if you don't know my youngest daughter, who's an actress, you're not missing a lot, but she's on me. And she and Valerie Jones would do these little sneaky things that only girls can do. And Jean would put her hands on her hips and say, "Oh, for crying in the sinks." And all of the kids knew that was the closest she ever came to saying even a bad word. She didn't even say dadgummit or darn or anything else, because she was such a strict Episcopalian. But there was one boy in the class that even did more orneriness than Quentin and Valerie, and his name was Thorndyke Bell Trauma. And Quentin said to me as I was leaving home this morning, be sure to tell him what she used to say. Thorndike Bell Trauma, you are a thorn in my side. And so I said, I will. But when I think mostly of Jean, I think of her pianistic accomplishments. She was an Episcopalian that was just into everything her church did. She was a guild member. She was a Bible school teacher. She taught Sunday school. She played the organ. She worked in the office to help. And periodically, she and I would play duets because I played for St. Francis of Rome. And of course, St. Francis of Rome, when it was still in Elsinore, was right across the alley from St. Andrews by the lake. And so we would do things, just the two of us, that only people that liked to play piano and liked to play organ would do, which was a great thing to do. She was a guild leader. And then, for many years, she was involved with Elsinore's premier club, or at least I think it's a premier club, the Elsinore Women's Club, because the Elsinore Women's Club was started in 1906, and anybody that was anybody in Elsinore belonged to the Women's Club. You didn't just get in. You had to be selected. You didn't cut mustard by just saying, I want to be a Women's Club member. You had to be invited. And then they sent out a delegation, kind of like from the UN, with white gloves. They'd come to your house, and they did this.
Well, I wouldn't pass.
They would go from room to room. They were especially careful of bathrooms and kitchens. Kitchens. Aren't you glad you joined when we're changing rules?
Right.
And I say that because I was the youngest member of the Women's Club when I was allowed to join. And I didn't expect to get approved because I had chickens, a goat, and I had a calf in the backyard because my daughter was in FFA at school, and we were always having animals to raise. You know, pigs, you name it, sheep. We had stuff. And when the delegation came to my house, they all came to the front door, all except one, who was Mabel Meisner, who was the senior member of the De Anza district. She was the former De Anza district president, but she also came from Kansas, and she knew me, so she came to the back door. Everybody else came to the front, properly with their gloves on, with their little furry things around their necks, their hats. And you had to serve tea. And you had to answer their questions as to why you wanted to become a Women's Club member. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, crikey. Mabel came to the back porch, and I got up to let her in, and she was standing there doing this with her feet. I said, what did you step in, Mabel? And she said, oh, you know, the chicken mess on over there. I said, you should have come to the front door. She said, no, I know. You always say, only strangers come to your front door. Your friends always come to the back. And so she came in, and I somehow passed muster. Jean joined a few years later when she retired from school. And she was not only president of our club, she was a district president, she was a state officer. She was always pushing educational things for young women, educational programs for the women in the community, educational ways that the women who were club members were engaging with everybody that they met on a first name basis, on a first time basis. You want to be helping, come to the Women's Club. You want to do something good? This is what the Women's Club does. So for many, many years, she was a guiding force in the Women's Club as well. I think that's about it.
We would like to thank you. Yes. So these are for you to take home.
Oh, thank you. I don't
Welcome. Yeah, kind of a donation from one of our existing items.
It's so
Well, I've enjoyed telling you about two of my friends and one that I got better acquainted with. I've always used to say that I knew more about Elsinore history until about 1943, and that was when I was born, and things got fuzzy about that time. But I've enjoyed living in this community for close to 60 years. I grew up in the Midwest. I love the fact that I grew up on a farm, and my parents were educators, and I married an educator. But what I love the most about this town, that I just always grabs my heart, the people here are real. They're sincere. They love you to death. They'll kick you in the tush if you do the bad things. They'll come up to you on the street, put their finger in your face and say, I didn't like you did this. I forgive you. Don't do it again. And nowhere else do you have what Lake Elsinore has. I know lots of people live here and think it's a hick town, but they better not say it around me, because I'll let them have it. And to all of you, especially Beth and Lori, for all that your family has done historically in this community, as business people, as educators, as just mom and dad. Your family is like a huge pillar of this community, and it has been my great honor and blessing to know not only your great aunt, but your mom and dad, to know you. And of course, Eric. I love Eric. Even though Eric didn't like me very much because I got a key to the newspaper and they took it away